Hi, I am Carmen Geddes and welcome to 10 Sisters TV. This video is step 2 of EasyPiecing Grid techniques, and we're doing this series of steps to kind of walk you through the whole process. So down below this video will be a link to step 1, and also on 10sisters.com we have lots of other tutorials, and one of the first ones you will see is kind of a demo of the whole process of how we're making quilts with EasyPiecing Grid. So if you are new, go check out the first video on our tutorials if you want to kind of see the whole process. This is step 2, where we're kind of talking about a few things. We want to talk about kind of how we're going to get started piecing this on the grid, but also kind of how to plan out the quilt, because I guess I would describe myself as a technique teacher, and to me what that means is there's always lots of options. There's some really great tips and different ways of how we're going to put this quilt together and make it the most fun and efficient for you. And so I want to just kind of get started with, actually now we have gone over the pattern, we've got all our fabrics cut out, and we are going to start piecing. And so the most important thing is that you are going to have your fusible side up. If you don't remember anything else that I say, you want to make sure that on your EasyPiecing Grid panel, that bumpy side is the fusible side. The other thing to notice is I've got my panel laid out horizontally. I am following a pattern in one of the books. If you are following one of the patterns, then the way I have my panel laid out, I want to make sure that my pattern is laid out the same way, if that makes sense. So this panel is horizontal, so I don't want to look at my pattern this way and start laying my squares down. So I'm going to turn my pattern this way and find that section that I'm working on, and then we're going to follow this layout to see where we lay out the squares. The other thing I wanted to point out is the quilt that I am working on is this mosaic in the book. And if you can kind of see, this is a section of this pattern that is already sewn, and I have it laid up here because now I'm going the other direction. So we're going to kind of talk about planning this quilt out too as you go. And so this section of the quilt is already sewn up. This is actually 2 panels worth. I have cut out 2-inch squares, and I'm working on the 1.5-inch grid. But I will say that when you're laying out your squares and when you're on your grid, I kind of call that the piecing, because that is really where you are doing the most work. Your sewing is going to be the easiest part of this whole process, but since I have sewn up a part of that, now I'm moving on to this next section that is not sewn up. So I will say it's a little easier if you iron the squares down on your whole quilt, right? Because now that that section is sewn up, the seam allowances have been taken up, it's smaller, so it's not matching up exactly. But I'm still laying this out here so I can actually see what colors are supposed to come next. And so the other thing I wanted to show you that I do on the panel is I'm looking at this upside down, or with the fusible side up. So if this was all ironed down, this would be my back side. Let's see if you can hopefully see this. This that I'm working on is actually panel number 6. Let's see if I can write upside down. Ta-da! So when I'm looking at the back of a panel, and I'll show you on another panel in just a minute, when I'm looking at the back of my panels, and I don't do this up in the extra space, I do it in a square because I'm going to trim all this away. I will write the name of the number of the panel that I'm working on. And so this layout is a 20-panel layout, but I am actually doing 5 panels one way, and because they are rectangle, I think I'm doing 3 or so panels the other direction, and I'll kind of figure that out as I go, because I want to make this kind of a square throw. I don't want to make a bed-size quilt, and so I'm kind of changing how many panels I'm using. So I'm still writing the number of that panel. That really helps me as I'm laying them all out, just to make sure that they are in order. So a couple of things that I do want to say about when you're laying your squares down on your grid. Now I've got this part of the panel is on a pressing board. I like a pressing board that has just canvas on the one side instead of a pretty fabric. I've got the canvas here because then I can see the grid when I lay it down there. And so that, I really like piecing that way. Now there's a couple things that you can do. If you want, you can just start laying. We're gonna just lay out these squares. And then after I get a section, I'm not doing these in actual order because I don't have all my fabrics, but let's just pretend that this goes here, these go here. So pay no attention that I actually have this out of order. Now I can lay out a section, and I'm going to use a travel size iron. This one's not hot. I'm going to use a travel size iron, being very aware of what is still fusible, and I'm going to hold that in place to press these down. Now you can also use an applique pressing sheet over the top of this. The applique pressing sheet, we'll talk about that a little bit later too. You know, that's going to allow you to put your iron on top of that applique pressing sheet, and it's not going to mess up the fusible part of your panel. Those Teflon sheets will not, they won't stick to it. Now, if you used parchment paper, which can be really popular as a pressing sheet, sometimes the little tiny dots of fusible might come off on that parchment paper, so just be very aware of that. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about when we're placing, and the other thing that I want to mention is a glue stick. And so we want to make sure that we use a water-soluble, washable school glue stick. I just stick with the Elmer's because I know it's starch-based. I've used it for many years. There's also some, basting glue sticks. You just want to make sure that it is a washable school glue, not like a liquidy or not a permanent glue. And so when we are putting this the glue down on the grid, we're not trying to glue the whole square in place. We're just going to put like a little swipe or two, just enough to hold that square in place. That way, when you're done ironing, or when you're done placing all your squares, then you can lift this up and take it over to your big iron. And so the other thing I wanted to point out, if you are using a glue stick, let's say you're not on a pressing board. If you have a nice table, but you can't see the grid through it, you can get a piece of poster board, or even, a piece of, white fabric to put underneath it. But if you are doing a glue stick, this foundation is nice and thin, and so sometimes the glue can seep through it a little bit. So every now and then, just lift up your panel and make sure you haven't glued it down to your table or whatever you're working on. So that's if you're using the glue stick. And so you're going to iron all your squares down on your whole panel, and then we're going to start sewing. But let's back up just a second. The other thing I want to cover is the size of your squares, okay? Now this same thing applies to half square triangles, which we do have a couple other videos on, and we will talk about it on one of our next steps. But you can cut out your squares so they will fit right. They can fit, let me get one here. Let's get in a good spot so you can see. And so the square can fit like this one right here. It's just barely inside, just on the barely inside of that dotted line. Your squares, if your square was cut, a thread or two bigger, it can fit right on top of that dotted line. These fabric squares can be butted right next to each other as you are placing them. They can be butted right next to each other, but what you want to avoid is them overlapping, because when we fold on that fold line to sew, what you want to avoid is having fabric in your fold. Now let's say you are like me and you cut probably 2 or 3 more layers than you should at a time. Or for whatever reason, and maybe your square might be on the small side, then as long as it fits, I don't know if I have a smaller one. Let's see if I have a small one. As long as it fits inside that square, and like this one is, see how this one is just a little, let me move that over a little bit so you can see that a little better. So do you see how this one is a little bit shy, right? It's a little shy. If I moved it right over to the edge, you know, that's a good 1/8 of an inch small. Then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to center that, because you can actually, so then if you're laying out your squares and then you're actually seeing a little gap in between the squares, don't worry about that, because even if your gap might be a little bit larger, let me pull a panel over here. So I've got a little example of that, like right here. So do you see how right here I've kind of got this series of squares that for whatever reason that I've just cut them a little bit on the small side. Now I want to point out a couple of things. Now do you see this square right here? I've got it placed on the grid, and this side of the square is right on top of the dotted line. Well, and I've got a pretty good sized gap over on this side. So this might be a time where I'm going to say, well, let me see if this will peel up. You're going to do that carefully. Let me turn my iron on. And see, that's going to peel right up. Now, see, this is sticking. So what that means to me is I used a glue stick right here. So the glue is going to be a little stickier. So I'm going to be careful, and I'm going to just kind of go around there, and that came right off. You might have a few little threads that come off. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this over and center it just a little bit better. So instead of having it clear over to one side and I've got a big gap here, I'm going to center this, and then I'm just going to, now when we're pressing our squares down, we want to focus on that word press and not iron, right? Iron, we're going to be gliding. Press, we're going to be holding in one spot. I do a nice hot iron. You can put steam in your iron, or you can do a little mist. Usually when I'm placing my squares, like I am here, I'm just kind of tacking them in place so they're not moving around. Then when I can look at the whole panel, everything is where I want it to be, then I'm going to give it a good press. Now, a question that comes up for me a lot is, well, Carmen, you're pressing right over here and you've got this gap. Aren't you worried that fusible is going to get on your iron? And I'll tell you, my fabric is here and the foundation is here. So even when I put my iron right on top of there, the glue does not get on the iron. Now, if I've got the iron over here or over outside where, yes, there's a lot of fusible and I stick my iron on that, well then, yes, I'm going to mess up my iron. Mr. Clean Magic Eraser is a great way to clean off your iron, by the way. I know that you would never do that, but I have done it a few times. The other thing that I wanted to point out about when there is a gap or you've got a square that might be a little bit on the small side, the first thing I do is what I just did. It's like, well, is that going to fit a little bit better if I reposition it so I don't have such a big gap on one side and not the other? But the other thing that I want to point out is that after all of our squares, let me get this out of the way here. After all of our squares are where we want them to be, then, like I said, we are going to trim it all the way. We're going to give it a good press. We're going to press this really well over the whole thing. We don't want any little corners lifting up. On the next video, when I do talk about, we're going to be talking about pressing more, we'll kind of go over this a little bit more. But the point I'm trying to show you now is that my cutting is not perfect. I've got some gaps in between some of these squares. You know, here's a good one right here. And so what I want to point out is when we are all ready to sew, and all these are all fused down really well. Then it's going to be fold on that fold line and sew your 1/4 inch seam. I do like to do a little back stitch at the beginning and the end of that seam, and then we're going to fold on that fold line and sew the seam. Now, where I've got these gaps, I'm going to show you when I fold that on the fold line, you can see that even though there's that little space in there, that is going to fit safely in the seam allowance. And so that to me is the whole key, is we want this to fit in the seam allowance. Now, you don't want to be in the danger zone where you've got one thread of your square that fits in your seam allowance. So you do want to have, enough fabric in that seam allowance that it's going to hold safely. But the point I want to make is that for a process that really should not be very forgiving, this is really forgiving. And so when you are placing your squares, try to center that square. If your square is bigger than the printed square, then I really recommend that you trim that down so that it fits in the square. But remember, when there is a gap, center that, and then you can double check, is that going to fit safely in my seam allowance when I sew it? And so after you are done with all your squares, again, I really recommend that we trim all that extra out of the way. And there is one exception to that. We're going to talk about that in the next step. And that is if we are going to fuse panels together. And one thing that I will say now, and I'll say it again several times, a big question that comes up fairly often for me is, okay, I've got all these panels sewn up, or let's back up, I have all these ironed down. And so do I just sew these up one at a time? Do I, how am I putting these panels together? So I'm just going to say this, but we'll demo it in one of the next steps. You can actually have lots of different options. We've got several videos on fusing panels together. I'm going to show you that in our next step. That is just an option. If I have this panel all done, the other thing I wanted to show you on this panel is on the back. I've got that written. This is panel number 5. And so I can just sew this panel up in both directions. It's all finished. And then I'm just going to sew each panel together just like a regular quilt block. We're going to go over this more when we get to talking about clipping and pressing our seam allowances. But right now, we have ironed all our squares down and we are ready to sew. So we're going to go on to the next step, which is which direction do I sew first? So join me on step 3. And if you want to find out more information, go to 10sisters.com, check out all our tutorials, and check out our patterns that you can download. It's also where you can go to the locator map and find where you can buy EasyPiecing Grid at your local quilt shop. It is for sale on the web, on our website, but we also have that locator map because sometimes it's great to be able to go in to your local shop. So join me on step 3 and we'll see you on the next one.